Someone's gotta change.
Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the future of the VCM, problems and likely outcomes. We've been running a series of webinars on the theme, a guide to corporate offsetting. In that guide, we've sought to explain the complexities of the carbon market, a market born not out of legislation, but out of a desire by corporates and individuals to do the right thing. So in the absence of a definitive rule set, complexity has crept in and market inefficiencies are rife. So this third and final edition seeks to draw together the threads of the last two sessions. I'm going to do a few short introductions, both of myself and of the speakers we've got on the panel today. Now, first a bit about me. I wear two hats. And they're complementary. I set up a company called Redshaw Advisors, and our mission at Redshaw Advisors is to empower companies to understand and manage their environmental market risks. But I also run a company called Net Zero Markets, and in that company we use our understanding of markets to design exchange-based products that are ultimately designed for end users to help simplify the path to net zero. Now, I've been active in environmental markets since the year 2000. I've been trading in carbon allowances since 2004, and that was during my 10 years as head of environmental markets at Barclays Investment Bank. I've been a member of the board of the Carbon Markets and Investors Association and of the International Emissions Trading Association, and now I'm CEO of those two companies, and we're involved in making markets work for the benefit of the climate. Now, I've cut my teeth helping trading in illiquid and new markets, and liquidity in markets can usually be taken for granted, but that's not the case in the voluntary carbon market. Now, the problem with illiquid markets is that they struggle to grow, and that's obviously the opposite of what we need to happen. In our work at Net Zero Markets, we aim to unblock the inefficiencies of the voluntary carbon market to facilitate a single priced hybrid offset aligned with a path to net zero. A single price for carbon really is the nirvana of carbon markets, and indeed the solution ultimately to climate change. But enough about me. When it comes to putting a fair price on a ton of carbon, you'll struggle to find more expertise than we have in our guests today. I'm looking forward to hearing their sage words on the problems afflicting the VCM, the solutions, and we'll venture into a little bit of crystal ball gazing towards the end. So let me introduce, without further ado, our first guest, Peter Vis. Peter, probably best known for his time spent at the European Commission. He was Deputy Head of Unit and Acting Head of Unit at DG Environment and DG Transport and Energy during the period that the EU ETS was debated, passed into law, and implemented. And I suspect there are a lot of people today whose jobs and livelihoods are some way dependent upon that groundbreaking piece of legislation that Peter and his team put together and made happen. Amongst other roles, he was later head of cabinet to Connie Hedegaard, who was the European Commissioner for Climate Action, and he was advisor to Jos Delbecq, another huge name in the EU emissions trading scheme community. People will know him well. More recently, Peter's left the Commission and he's been teaching a master's course at the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance, bit of a mouthful there. And that course is on international climate governance and policies. But he also advises Ruud Pedersen's clients on EU policy in relation to sustainability issues, climate change, and the energy transition. Welcome, Peter. And before we get started, I'm going to get on to David Antonioli. I don't think David needs much introduction to a group of people interested in the VCM. But by way of a bit of background on David, He's a leading international expert on environmental and developmental issues and the application of market mechanisms to bring about environmental and social improvement. And David has developed projects that have operated under major international agreements, for example, the Montreal Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, and now the Paris Agreement. David started out in this line of business working at ICF Consulting back in 1994. He developed projects under the Montreal Protocol, as I mentioned. He then moved on to the United States Agency for International Development, probably better known as USAID. And there he oversaw baseline studies for renewable energy and forest protection efforts. And then later at Ecosecurities, a huge project developer back in the glory days of the Clean Development Mechanism. And he cut his teeth there on landfill gas projects and started to tackle the problems that were the early issues in the voluntary carbon market. So there is no one, I don't think, better versed in both the issues and the potential solutions when it comes to the VCM. So David, now better known, or probably most well known amongst this audience, he currently serves as Chief Executive Officer of Verra. They're a non-profit organization, if you don't know them, and they develop and manage standards that are used to certify activities that reduce and or remove greenhouse gas emissions and generate measurable sustainable development impacts. Welcome, David. Now, before I give him the chance to speak, I want to frame the problem a little bit and listing a few of the problems faced by the VCM. The first, I think, and most important in terms of getting in the way of scaling the VCM, is that there are too many prices. Too many prices for there to be a reliable and meaningful indicator of value. And that's because there's too many variables. A price of a VAR, an offset, can depend on vintage, technology, project jurisdiction. A least developed country will probably have a higher value than a developed country carbon credit. Quantity of a transaction, the verification standard used, all of these things affect the price. And so that results in there being a lot of different prices. Measuring additionality can be difficult, and so can demonstrating permanence. So having absolute confidence in the carbon credit you have being additional is something that can cause problems. The fact that avoidance carbon offsets, which is the very vast majority of offsets issued today, have no future in a net zero world. Only removals will be useful in the future. And so quite how the market transitions from one to the other is very much up for grabs. And the problem with those removals, the new hope, if you like, to fix climate change, is that there are very few of them and they are very, very expensive. Yeah. Now, there's no legislation, nor are there common rules for how to use the voluntary carbon market. And there are competing voices for what should and shouldn't count as a carbon neutral claim, or indeed a valid carbon offset. And last but not least, there are bad actors in this market that use the complexities, some of which I've described, the complexities of the VCM to make personal gain under the cover of fixing climate change. I'm sorry to say that some retailers use similar techniques to the criminals that have operated in the voluntary carbon market. Now, I come from, my origins are compliance carbon trading, so that's cap and trade, and I'm an unashamed supporter of cap and trade. And I would say that global cap and trade would solve pretty much all of these problems, but we seem as far away from that ideal as we've ever been, which is a bit of a sad state of affairs. Nonetheless, companies with no legal obligation to do so, they want to account for their carbon footprints. And to meet that demand, we've got the voluntary carbon markets with all of its strengths and weaknesses. So what we're going to discuss today is how can we build on those strengths and defeat some of those weaknesses. I'm going to start off with you, Peter. Have I got this last point wrong? I mean, what are the prospects for voluntary and compliance markets to meet?
Well, I think we know that there are more and more compliance markets developing across the globe. And the EU's experience has certainly been rich in this field. For a while, the EU did allow there to be offsets with the UN's clean development mechanism, and that's a little bit of a mechanism that I think was the origin of the voluntary carbon markets. A lot of the operators in the voluntary carbon market probably started their lives trying to program or develop, if you like, clean development mechanism projects. So anyway, so I think the point is that they could coexist and they could work together. But there are, from a regulator's point of view, that is the point of view I am most familiar with, there are risks for the regulators if they link up or if they connect to credits over which they have no control over the quality. And I think we were relying in the EU on the UN quality control, which didn't prove entirely satisfactory, but there were many advantages with having done that linking early on, as well as disadvantages. There were a bit of both. The advantages, of course, was that everyone became more familiar with the real potential of these market-based mechanisms like the CDM was at the time. And it helped the EU meet its international commitments under the Kyoto Protocol at less cost than it would have otherwise done. And in so doing, it generated some finance towards projects in developing countries, all of which are very positive aspects of what we tried. So that's, I'd say, the coexistence can happen, has happened to a certain extent, but whether it happens in the future, some regulatory schemes allow there to be some sorts of offsets admitted, and others don't. For the moment, the EU is taking a precautionary approach. It's being cautious about it because there's a lot still perhaps to still be done in the voluntary carbon market space, and indeed in terms of the Paris agreements accounting too.
Very good, thanks. And when you were designing and implementing the EU ETS, you had to overcome all manner of problems. And one of the things that the EU got very right was full standardization, complete fungibility that enabled the delivery of a well-functioning market. But what compromises did you have to make to achieve that? What could the VCM learn from the lessons that you learned implementing the EU ETS?
Well, I mean, the EU ETS was an incredible journey to have followed because it was starting from scratch. It started before the clean development mechanism was up and running and so on. What we wanted to do from the very beginning was to try and keep things as simple as they could be. And I say that so cautiously because everyone who isn't familiar with carbon pricing and compliance markets and voluntary markets tends to think it's a very, very complex area. But I think simplicity is a principle we should keep at the forefront of our thinking. And I would even say, we could perhaps do with more simplicity in the voluntary carbon markets, if I may say so. What you also need, and what we wanted to ensure from the start, was robustness in terms, for example, of monitoring, reporting, and verification. Now, we were all starting out on a journey, and there may have been many respects in which we were not very good at it, but that was the goal. And I think that's what we've been trying to enhance over the years, so that the underpinning of it is solid, so that the carbon accounting within the emissions trading system is robust. And that, I think, we are in a better place than many other compliance schemes across the world. We've got great experience now, and it's working well. I'll be honest, it's helping the EU meet its international commitments at a lower cost than we would expect to be the case if we had not gone down this road of using the market-based approaches.
Great. Would you agree that in the EU ETS it was easier to say that a ton is a ton
Well,
in a way that the VCM isn't able to? Is there a difference there?
I'll tell you two examples that one principle we said was we'll start only with CO2, only with carbon dioxide, because we thought that the monitoring capability for that was more robust than for other greenhouse gases. And gradually, as capabilities have improved, more greenhouse gases have been integrated into the ETS than was there initially. So we started in a cautious way. And I think we only had, and we only ever will have, is sort of one method or rule book of how you monitor, report, and verify your emissions. One of the things that's so sort of striking about my perception of the voluntary carbon markets is there are so many standards of monitoring and reporting and verification. My early career was spent in the world of accountancy. And as far as international accounting standards are pretty fundamental to reporting, financial reporting across the world and all the trading that's built on that. So you've got to have those very solid foundations. We need them in carbon markets as well, on which we can build and on which liquidity and scale can be achieved. So I hope we can get there. I mean, that's a little bit the challenge that's in front of us.
And so you've been doing your work at the European Universities Institute, and I've seen a couple of your reports that you've produced with Joss. And actually, there was one I'm thinking of right now had essentially a perfect précis of the problems that afflict the voluntary carbon market. Are there what are the key reforms that you believe should be brought forward in the VCM in order to overcome some of the issues that it faces?
Well, I think the first thing to highlight is that there must be a balance between supply and demand. I would say that it sounds so obvious, but if the EU had not been admitting clean development mechanism credits into its emissions trading system, demand for CDM would have been very, very low, much, much lower than it was in practice. So that, there has to be that sort of basic balance between supply and demand, or the prices will stay very low. And there will be, I don't think you'll have a very clear signal, very clear incentive to try and avoid emitting carbon dioxide if there's if there's a very low cost of polluting. That will just be a bit of a business as usual scenario. I think as I have already said, I think the monitoring and accounting standards for carbon should be as unified as possible. I think on that basis, different jurisdictions can all collaborate, as indeed the voluntary carbon market would wish. And then of course we need, and first and foremost perhaps, is that whatever credits might be produced by the voluntary carbon markets, they have to be of high environmental integrity. If that isn't the case, then we're lost. This isn't worth doing from an environmental point of view unless that can be assured. And indeed, the corporates who are looking to buy credits, a lot of them are very concerned about the risk of their reputation suffering if they are seen to be buying poor environmental quality credits. So that's a very, very fundamental building block. I think the environmental integrity combined with the robust carbon accounting methodologies, I think those are the building blocks. And then, of course, scale, liquidity will come with time. But we've got to do first things first.
Fair enough. And you're absolutely right. I think that the EU ETS of all systems has suffered from the price being too low for a long time and not providing the incentive because demand wasn't equal to supply. And of course, the voluntary carbon market currently has the same issue, and quite how to fix that is up for grabs. So, David, this seems like a pretty good time to bring you into the discussion. I mean, one of the challenges to the future growth of the VCM, aside from demand, is actually demonstrating that a project is truly additional. I mean, with the economics of energy efficiency and renewables changing all the time, both in terms of the capital cost of installing wind turbines, for example, but now the oscillating fossil fuel prices going up at the moment, or actually going down at the moment, having gone up quite a lot in the past 12 months. The economics of REDD+ projects are easy to prove, but the rate of deforestation, the baseline, is less easy to prove. How does Verra determine that projects are not going to be doing what they were doing anyway?
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter, for those comments, and certainly Lewis for the gracious introduction and invitation to be here. So first and foremost, I mean, as a standard setting body, we're committed to developing and enforcing the highest standards for a variety of different environmental projects. And we do that in partnership with scientists. We assess best practices, and basically what we have is a rule book of procedures and requirements that projects have to follow. And that covers everything from additionality to baselines, to permanence, to accounting, to monitoring, all of the things that you can imagine fit into that box. And so as a standard setting body, our job is to make sure that we're continuously, that we do proper consultation, and we, develop something that gives that integrity. But we also recognize that things change, and we need to kind of continually improve our work. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been updating our rules over time, ever since we started. So one good example you mentioned was renewable energy. In 2019, we decided that actually we should not credit renewable energy projects, because at the time, and I think historically, we've seen the cost of renewables fall, and therefore they don't need that extra jump. And so we decided that we weren't going to credit renewable energies anymore, the renewable energy projects and energy efficiencies. We still allow them in least developed countries. We think there's economic circumstances that justify them being developed there. But that was a big change. And those kinds of things, play out in how we work. Another good example is our work on REDD. You mentioned REDD and baselines. So we've actually now are able to have better data and a better understanding and better models for how you calculate, how you assess these projects, and developing new ways of how you determine the baseline. So again, as a standard setting body, to your overall question, we need to have a very clear focus on integrity, and we need to build our systems around that. But we also need to make sure that we're incorporating new science, new best practices, and the latest thinking so that we can stay current.
So Verra is the biggest game in town. You issue more carbon credits into the voluntary market than anybody else, but there are a number of other well-known organizations doing the same thing. We've got the gold standard, and we've got the climate action registry. What are the problems that have been recently reported about forestry in the case of Verra, are they common to everybody? Is it something that the other standards are also grappling with? Or how does that work?
Well, I can only say, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. I mean, these challenges have been specifically in relation to REDD. We are the major standard setting body that deals with REDD projects. You're starting to see new REDD efforts at the jurisdictional level. And I think ultimately, what's at play here is a fundamental question, which is the counterfactual nature of REDD. And basically, in order to credit a REDD project, you have to determine what would have happened in the project area without the project intervention. Now, that's a counterfactual, and that's hard to determine. And unfortunately, it's impossible to determine with certainty. I mean, we will never know what would have happened on a project site without the project. That's a parallel universe that we don't inhabit. So we have to have rules and procedures that give confidence to what would have happened. And so that's why we need to be, very linked and close to kind of all the scientific developments and the tools that are available to make sure that we're doing that properly. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I mentioned the improvements we're doing to our rules. So the first thing we're doing is that we're consolidating the methodologies. So we started by having a number of methodologies that we would use. And this is because we wanted to make sure that there was different models for how you could do this in a credible way. And so we've now learned, and now we're bringing those together into single consolidated methodology. We're also using a jurisdictional based approach. When we first started, and kind of you used the word nirvana about the market, the nirvana in red has always been, let's kind of go to jurisdictional scale accounting and crediting. And that's great, but nobody really understood, we had no models, we had no data on what a jurisdictional baseline actually looked like. Today we do. So now we can hang our hat on that and say, okay, now that we know the tools to develop a jurisdictional baseline, let's use that and let's transition to that. Another important change we've made, this actually is a one across the program, is for projects, they can only use a baseline for 6 years. It used to be, when we first started this journey, we understood that 10 years was enough and was sufficient. But now we're learning that conditions on the ground change and need to update your baseline. So we've shortened that to 6 years. And the final one is digital MRV, right? We're really doing a concerted effort to bring kind of the transparency and the rigor that remote sensing and other technologies can bring to the table. So again, these are the kinds of things that we need to be embracing and looking and kind of incorporating to our rules so that we can stay current and continue to provide the credibility the market needs.
Thanks. There's a number of companies that have recently, the last couple of years, raised vast sums of money to run checks on the projects that you and the other standards are issuing carbon credits to. So the so-called VCM ratings agencies. What's Verra not doing that they are? How are they raising this money? And you're obviously very well rehearsed in all of this. You've been grappling with these issues for 20 years. What are they adding to the process?
Well, I think, the market has grown so much. There's a variety of different methods. And I think, to be fair, there is some confusion about whether the projects are being assessed. And they're not. I mean, they have again, I mentioned before, when we first started this journey, we thought it was important to be innovative and to create different models because nobody had done this. Remember, people have been talking about RED for years, but nobody had actually put pen to paper to create an accounting methodology. So we deliberately created a system that enabled various methodologies to be developed. And so now that the market has matured, people are saying, well, how do I know that this methodology isn't better versus the other? That's one of the reasons we're consolidating them. So, I think that there's just a function of the fact that there's some confusion in the market. And, I think we need to accept that. And they're doing a valuable job in helping, buyers understand, what they consider might be a different kind of credit versus the other. In the end of the day, it's good. It's a sign that the market is maturing. I think that's a great thing. I think once over time, we'll see how these play out because again, we're consolidating the methodologies. We'll have a single approach. And I think there'll be less variability in the future.
So actually, I'm going to bring Peter back in because we talked earlier about standardization, fungibility, a ton being a ton. And I mentioned a number of factors that influence price, vintage and jurisdiction and project type and so on. In your view, Peter, do you think the ratings agencies are adding another layer of complexity to an already complex process, or are they making it better, moving more towards a standardized approach?
Well, look, I think rating agencies are there to help buyers and increase confidence in the market. And I think that is welcome. Markets need that confidence. I mean, the EU doesn't have rating agencies for the EU allowances because they are all the same. They have the same status, whichever country they're issued by, and whatever vintage they might have, year of issuance, it doesn't matter. It's a fungible commodity that, of course, enables there to be a lot of liquidity and a lot of derivatives. And I know that there's worries about sophisticated markets that might need rating agencies being the sorts of nests of speculators and such like. But I think we all can appreciate the advantages that exist in a market where some people are prepared to take more risk than others. I, as a house owner insure my house in case it should burn down. And some other company somewhere is prepared to take the risk for me. And that's a service to me. And they do that for lots of other people. And so they're used to managing risk. We have different risk thresholds. Now, that's fine. I mean, that means that I can actually be more cautious. And often companies in a carbon market like to hedge liabilities forward. They like to be sure that they will be able to buy the carbon allowances they need for 2-3 years ahead. And a big liquid market can help that happen. Now, those sorts of luxuries of ample liquidity and fungibility are just the things that aren't in the voluntary carbon market. And I think that is where there would be great benefit in there being some sort of harmonization of, let me say, the building blocks, the monitoring, reporting, and verification rules. And then everyone would be able to sort of be operating under the same rules of the process. And I sort of worry that there should be a menu of standards to choose between. I mean, that would be the sort of predicament I would feel if I was a corporate looking to do something good for the climate. I'd be saying which set of standards are the good ones. And I don't know what quite David would say to that in reply. Of course, I'm sure you would recommend Verra's, and I'm sure deservedly so, but it's just to say, it's confusing that there are so many. And for a sort of a layman, you ask, well, why are there so many? Is it so hard to agree certain things, or are there different approaches that can be taken, and so on? So that's all the sorts of doubts that have crept into people's minds. And I will say that they've crept into the minds of EU decision makers, parliamentarians and ministers, who in the end collectively have decided to back away from using offsets, and that the commitments that Europe is making now under the Paris Agreement are commitments that Europe, at least now, intends to make through its own efforts and not by buying credits from outside Europe. Now, I'm not saying that that decision is set in stone, but it's where they are now. And I think without reassurance as to the good governance of voluntary carbon markets, it will be difficult to move those sorts of decision makers towards more favorable stances with regards to the voluntary carbon market.
Thanks, Peter. David, I don't know if you want to come back on that. You're welcome to if you'd like to, but otherwise I've got another question for you.
Yeah, my guess is we're probably going in the same direction. But I mean, I would agree with Peter, and I do think that there needs to be some sort of signposting for what counts. All right. And yeah, of course, I'd say that we provide great credits, but I also wouldn't say that the other guys' credits are bad. I think there's some very good other standards out there. You know, gold standard's good, the Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Register. I mean, these are good standards. They have good procedures. In fact, if you look at the underlying, infrastructure that we all have, it's all the same. Kind of not the same, but very similar, right? We just have different approaches for how we deal with additionality and permanence, et cetera. But I think it's generally the same. So I think what you need is some entity, and I'll go straight. I don't know if you're going to go there, Lewis, but I think there's initiatives like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Markets that's attempting to assess what counts as a real carbon credit. And they're doing that by looking at, are these programs structured in a way that generates a carbon credit that is credible? And I think that's very good. I think it's about accountability. I mean, if we're perfectly honest, right, the only people who've kind of come knocked on our door and said, let me look into what you're doing is CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation through ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And that was a very good exercise. And they came in, they, kicked the tires, they looked under the hood, and they said, okay, yeah, we like your procedures. We think they generate a credible credit. That needs to be done across the board. And I think that's the work of the IC-VCM. And I think it can be very powerful because there does need to be a menu of accepted credits. Otherwise, it is, very hard to wrap your head around this. And the only people who do enter this market are people who are very, very committed and have the resources to do all the due diligence, which is huge. So the view, I think, from the IC-VCM is that if we can create this, standard level of performance that credits meet, then that'll give the buyers a lot more confidence that, hey, actually, I'm actually buying something that's been vetted and that is legitimate. And I think that's going to be very important. But the other one I don't want to leave off the table, because we're focusing on the supply side, is the demand side. So what kind of claims you can make, and that's a whole nother world that needs to be kind of defined. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. If you want to talk more about the IC-VCM first.
Well, no, I mean, I think you've covered it well. I've got one follow-up question on the subject, but I will just mention, because you, in your blog earlier this week, you mentioned the difficulties that we've been discussing so far, but also the importance of the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and the IC-VCM, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. They sound quite similar, but VCMI is looking at claims and whether and how people should make a claim of carbon neutrality or carbon neutral product, and they didn't specify what they should use, but the IC-VCM, what the VCMI did is defer or refer people to the IC-VCM's decision on what should count. I suppose the problem with the IC-VCM is they haven't told us yet. By the time we get some sort of answer, it'll have been 3 years since they formed. And I think that speaks to the complexity of the problem, the difficulty of coming up with the answer. I know you have been close to the IC-VCM, and I imagine you follow it very closely, David. What difference do you think, when they do finally publish their core carbon principles, what difference will it make to Verra's issuance to projects? Would it perhaps reduce issuance to certain types of project? Would it issue carbon offsets and allow the IC-VCM to put another stamp of approval on top of your existing stamp of approval and then bifurcate the market? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, good question. So just full disclosure, I sit on the board of the IC-VCM, but I'm a non-voting member. I was voted on as a representative of the supply side. There are representatives of the supply side, that's me. There's a representative of intermediaries, and there's a representative of the demand side. So there's 3 kind of market representatives sitting on the board. We can provide our opinions, but we don't have a vote. And we have to disclose our conflicts, et cetera. So just to be clear. But I think the goal is, and I think that would be, I mean, the idea is that the IC-VCM will come out with a set of core carbon principles and an assessment framework of the different greenhouse gas crediting programs, and determine, which ones pass the test and which ones don't. And the ones that pass will be able to use, I don't even know what the label will be called. Let's call it an IC-VCM label on their credits. And that'll be good. And I think, there's important things that will make us think about. I mean, if we don't pass the test for whatever reason, if our VCS program doesn't pass the test, then we'll have a bit of a reckoning and have to think, okay, what do we need to do? But those discussions will be very important so that we're all doing the same thing. I'll give you a very simple example. It's about improvement, right? So one of the things that we've been talking about internally, it's played out in a broader conversation, was, what kind of review are we doing to our methodologies kind of on a regular basis? And so we had a process, and kind of our red projects kind of fell into that because there was various methodologies, and we decided it was time. But that process needs to play out across all of our methodologies. So there needs to be a process. That's the kind of thing that I would expect the IC-VCM to check. Like, how often are you reviewing your methodologies to make sure that they're still useful and appropriate and credible? So there are some very important things, and I do think it will kind of keep us all accountable to a certain level of performance, and I think that's a good thing.
Very good. And actually that brings, I mean, if the future is core carbon principle stamp of approval allows some offsetters at least to buy into the voluntary carbon market and increase that demand, hopefully, such that the difference between supply and demand narrows. That's one route we might take, but it brings us on actually to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. how, and let's maybe start with Peter, given his international legislation experience. How's that going to integrate with the existing voluntary carbon market, do you think? I mean, Article 6 has been talked about for quite some time now, since 2015, in fact. When could that become a meaningful market? That might be one for you, actually, David. Will it replace the VCM? What are the prospects for the whole of the voluntary carbon moving wholesale towards Article 6?
Can I then just say as a first remark, in a way, there's something in me that would welcome the streamlining of the voluntary carbon markets. I think some of the comments being made in the chat are comments that I can identify with, is that there are so many of these acronyms, so many players in this market. And if the UN were somehow to oversit all of, or set the standards, if you like, or operate as they have been doing for the CDM, but they would have to do it better. But for me, that is the sort of thing that the laymen among us who are not into this in the minute detail would feel, okay, well, the UN thinks it's okay, so we should be able to trust that. And that was a little bit the premise that the EU made when it allowed the CDM credits into the emissions trading system initially. Now, what it subsequently found was that even the CDM's executive board wasn't a sufficiently robust oversight body. It was politicized in part anyway, and it led to bad projects being approved. So that rather disenchanted Europeans with the CDM. And I think the second chance we're getting now is that Article 6 is going to have a supervisory body. And it's already got that, but it's got to finish its work in putting all the parts into place for the new mechanism, if you like, to take a life of its own. But this is a second chance to do it better. And basically, the Europeans are not in a hurry for using these voluntary carbon credits, I mean, the European governments. So they would rather see a good supervisory body that does what it's supposed to do. And then there might be a conversation about whether or not international offsets can be used towards the fulfillment of commitments. But as I say, the presumption is that the EU is going to do this within its own borders. And to some extent, that process has already started when recently the European Commission proposed a law for the certification of carbon dioxide removals, which is a voluntary certification process, I would add. So the word voluntary is in it, but I will assume that the mechanics of that, the monitoring and reporting processes and the certification processes will all be done robustly and in a way that's compatible with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I don't think Europe's going to wait for the VCMs to get themselves organized. It's doing its own thing, but I think this is a chance not to be missed by the UN to continue playing a role as facilitator and provider of a relative simplicity over what is today a too complex marketplace.
And I'll come on to removals in a question in a moment, but you made the point there that the EU is going its own way and want to do everything domestically, which suggests that demand for Article 6 credits won't be there. David, what do you see the future holding in terms of what role will Verra play if there was a purely Article 6 world? And do you think that we've talked about core carbon principles, but if Article 6 rules, if there was a stamp of approval from those Article 6 rules on a carbon credit, surely that would supplant everything that's out there in the market. How's it going to work in the future?
Good question. I mean, it's interesting. When I first started this job back in 2008, I thought it was a 7-year job. I thought, the Obama administration was coming to town. the US was going to pass cap and trade legislation, following Europe's lead. Europe was going to tighten the screws, and we'd all have the problem sorted, and we could, close the door, turn the lights out, and be done with it. But sure enough, that hasn't happened. I think there's a real lack of political willingness to put a price on carbon. You started that at the very beginning of this. If that were to happen, then great. Then all the learning that we've done will get passed on somewhere, and we would evolve to, either the visa program might disappear, or we might evolve into some sort of supporting function. We are starting to see this in some countries, where countries actually endorse or support the use of the VCS program. In Colombia and South Africa, for example, they have carbon taxes, and they said actually we'll allow corporates to pay their carbon taxes with a carbon credit that's generated either by the VCS program, the gold standard, or the CDM. So we're starting to see that play out, and I think that that's a very important aspect of the work that we do, because we support governments implementing climate change legislation. It's not all going to be a cap and trade, but back to your question, I think it's too difficult for me to say how that would play out, but we welcome the advancement and the developments of Article 6.4. I think it's good to see different models out there, and if they're if the Secretariat develops something that's useful and credible, that's great. It'll give people more option, and I think people do tend to see Article 6.4 for future compliance trades. Again, that goes back to the government's willingness to put a price on carbon. I think it's rather, I am an eternal optimist, but on this one, I just can't see the world putting a price on carbon, which is why I think the voluntary space is so important. And rather than having the viewpoint that I had when I first started the job, which was like, okay, let's think about how we're going to shut this place down in 7 years. Actually, what we have now in the voluntary market, and you've mentioned this before, that there's this perception by companies that they need to do something about climate change. And that something starts with measuring your footprint. But once you measure your footprint, you kind of have to do something about it, right? And doing something about it means ideally internal reductions, and even ideally beyond that, kind of offsetting. And that gets into this whole discussion. But then the company says, well, what can I buy and what can I say about it? If we have clarity in respect of what you can buy, right, and what you can say about it, and that what you can say about it involves you following the mitigation hierarchy, like meaning you have to have a net zero target. You have to perform against that net zero target with internal reductions. Then I think the voluntary market can play sort of a shadow regulation, if you will, and essentially kind of encourage, or not even kind of obligate, the corporate sector to go beyond what the governments are asking them for. And that's where I think we all align here. We all want corporate accountability. And I think the voluntary market has the potential for creating that infrastructure. Right now, it's just too complicated. So we have some work to do. But I think that's my view of where we'll go, at least in the short to medium term.
Oh, thanks. And it's probably worth pointing out that the clean development mechanism suffered from the same issues around additionality and permanence and so on as the voluntary standards do today. But what you've been doing at Verra and the others have been doing is picking up the work that they did and moving it forward, improving it, adding new methodologies. And so probably the future international regime will look at what you're doing, and no doubt pick that up after you picked it up from them originally. One of the last question I've got for the both of you is this net zero future? And actually, one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A refers to this also. So I said at the beginning that there is no role for avoidances in a net zero future, and the reason for that is because if you're hitting net zero, true net zero globally, the only way that you can put a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere through whatever method, whether that's chopping down a tree or flying a plane or running a coal-fired power station, the only way you can continue to do that is if you pay someone else to suck a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Right? You can't have avoidances anymore. You can only have removals. The trouble is, removals are really expensive. And while there are ideas around the cost of long-lived removals dropping substantially, I suspect that cost will still be an order of magnitude higher than the current cost, average cost of a voluntary carbon credit. So the question I've got for both of you is, can we get to net zero with the voluntary carbon market, bearing in mind the word voluntary, or do we get to net zero via the voluntary carbon market? How do you think that's going to play out?
David, do you want to go?
I was going to let you go, Peter.
Okay,
Right?
I'm ready to say my piece, just insofar as I would agree that by 2050, if the EU aspires to be net zero, and many other parts of the world aspire to be net zero, that means whatever remaining emissions they have to be balanced by removals of equivalent integrity and duration. And that's it. I mean, I think the reduction phase ought to be trying to squeeze down the emissions as low as possible by 2050. But at that point, it's going to be only removals that we need, and we need to be thinking already now how to scale up the removals so that their costs can come down. And I do think that if ever the EU re-engages with the voluntary carbon markets in any shape or form, it will be with a preference for removals, and it will be subject to the condition of there being what we call corresponding adjustments for the UN accounting to be absolutely clear who's claiming that removal, irrespective of where it's been generated. You know, there must be no double counting. So I would say removals are the future, yes, and we've just got to try and scale them up, and that requires an active, deliberate actions by the governments and by corporates who want to make that happen sooner. And then, of course, reductions, yes, they're all very valuable, but they're not the long-term solution.
So I would agree with some of that, but have a slightly different viewpoint. So I would agree with the point that, yes, by 2050, we need to be a net zero world, and we need to have developed the technologies and the approaches that are able to remove the carbon from the atmosphere, because we're not going to completely do away with fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. But on the pathway there, I think it's really important that we not undermine efforts to avoid emissions. So, for example, forests, right? We could easily say, okay, if it's all about removals, let's focus on removals. But what's going to happen? Let's just take red finance, right? There's a lot of countries that are struggling to figure out how they protect their forests. If this support isn't there for them to protect that and to learn via viable models for how you provide, improved agricultural production and have value for the trees standing, then we list the opportunity. And then the problem in 2050 is that much worse, because all those emissions have gone to the atmosphere. So I think this is not an either or question. This is a both. There does need to be a transition over time, but I'm very excited about the work that we're starting to see in the VCS and in the market, looking at removals, at technological removals, DAC. There's also huge efforts being focused on reforestation effort, reforesting degraded lands. Those are really, really good projects. And so I think it's a both question, and we need to be careful not to undermine existing efforts that will help, not only preserve forests and keep carbon out of the atmosphere, but let's remember that these projects also provide really important support and benefits to local communities who often are struggling to survive.
No, thanks. Interesting answers from you both, and I'll posit the final proposal to you, which is, if I say 2050, because on average, most developed countries are aiming for a 2050 net zero end point. But there are, of course, other countries committing to 2060 and possibly beyond. But let's assume it's 2050. If we're going to hit net zero in 2050, surely we need a mandatory global cap and trade regime where the cap is actually zero, but the trading is mandatory. You have to have a removal if you're going to emit CO2. So the question I'm going to ask you, relatively simple, although you may want to color it in a bit. If that's the case, if you accept that proposition that 2050 there has to be a mandatory system, when do you think we'd get a mandatory system in place if it's obvious that that's what we need to do? 2030, 2040, 2045, 2049, or 2050? What do you think?
You're putting me on the spot. David, you go this first time. You go first time now.
I was going to take the heat off of you because I know less about the regular, these regulatory frameworks, Peter. So I was willing to kind of take the heat off. I can't say, Lewis. I mean, I just said before that I find it hard to believe that the governments of the world will agree on putting a price on carbon, and this is essentially the same thing. I keep hoping that that's going to happen. I mean, that's what I would say is that, I would love there to be a price on carbon. And that's what that's why, we've always thought that that was going to be a really important aspect. And I think it still will be. But I find it, maybe I'm just clouded by the politics here in the US where there's just no sight, no viable way that I can see that we're going to turn to a productive conversation on putting a price on carbon. So the US being such a big part of this, I just have a hard time thinking of when that's going to happen.
So does that mean we're going to miss the 2050 net zero target?
No, not necessarily. Not if we build the voluntary markets to do what they can do. Now, I think that there's enough pressure on the corporates to do the right thing. I think we could see it come close. But again, I would love to see regulation. I think that would be really critical. But I think in the meantime, the voluntary markets need to do what they can.
Peter?
Well, I too don't think there will be a global trading scheme or linking of schemes globally. What we have is the Paris Agreement, and I think the accounting under that has to be agreed in a harmonized way. But I think countries are going to get to their net zero destinations in different ways. Some are going to use compliance markets and some are not. It depends a lot on the profiles of the country. If they've got big forests, they might be wanting to do it that way as opposed to Europe, which has, a big industry as well. So I think I wouldn't hold your breath for the government, for the global governance, because I just think there isn't an appetite for it among governments. But there is an appetite to act on climate change shared by many corporates. And we've got to try and incentivize them. And that can, of course, be done through carbon markets, voluntary or compliance, or it can be done through other regulatory measures, standards and such like, or banning the use of things, which, Europe has got examples of all of these things, but we're doing it with a mixture of policy tools. And I think that mixture is rather the order of the day. That would be my last word on that.
That's fine. No, thank you very much, both. In actually the poll that we've run, the majority, or rather the largest share of the vote has gone to a merge of compliance and voluntary markets by 2040. But actually the second largest is never. There'll be two distinct markets. So there's a good chunk of our audience that are more or less aligned with the thinking of our panel. Now I've let this run a little bit over the Q&A time, because actually, as I've been looking at the questions as they've come in, I believe that we've answered a lot of them. There's one here on why the recent fall in prices, in VCM prices. I'm not going to ask you to commentate on that. I'm not sure that's your areas of expertise, but for the person who asked that question, please feel free to get in touch and we can give you at least some of the factors involved. We've got a question on whether the carbon market should or will merge with the biodiversity credit market. I don't know, David, do you want to quickly say something on that?
Yeah, sure. No, great question. My view is that they should not. Just to be clear, carbon markets, at least in respect to biodiversity, there's a lot of great RED projects and kind of natural climate solution projects that support biodiversity, and that's great. They can be part of those projects. But I think the risk here is confusing or conflating these two very different concepts, because a RED project, to be clear, is conserving a forest that is under threat. And so, but the further you get away from that, you still have, pristine areas where you have, for example, indigenous communities living in forests. And they've been doing the right thing, not just for years, but for decades and generations. And yet they live in, rather meager circumstances. So how can we value the work that they do to support their development in a way that conserves biodiversity? That because they're not ready, they're not taking out a chainsaw and saying we're going to chop this forest down. That forest isn't necessarily under threat, and there's other instances like that. So I think the biodiversity piece needs to be separate, especially because it needs to be based on the kind of biodiversity. In some cases, it could be additive, meaning how can we support folks who actually are doing the right thing to do to support biodiversity across the world. And so I think initially, at least, our view, and we'll see how this plays out. We're in the process of working with a number of other organizations to develop a biodiversity framework. We're purposefully not calling it a credit because it's not initially designed to be that way. But it's a really complicated piece of work, and we'll see how we do. But I would say that I think we need to be careful ultimately not to conflate the two, because then you lose that clear demarcation for RED and carbon projects, which are about purposefully protecting forests that are under threat or helping to build forests where they aren't there.
Thanks. And I'm conscious we're over time, everybody. I will say that one of the questions is, could David expand more specifically on how Verra is going to improve RED baseline measurement? I'm not going to ask that question to you though, David, because we don't have a lot of time, but also I'm aware that you have a couple of webinars scheduled in the next few days. And so for those of you that really want to know about that, I know it's a very topical subject, and I know David knows an awful lot about it. So please follow up with Verra's website and get on those webinars. We've got questions on a streamlined single carbon market. I think we've covered that. We've covered, will the EU revisit its stance on importing carbon removals from outside the EU? We've got an opinion there. And one last question on unification of methodologies, maybe creating a quasi-monopoly of suppliers. I'll point out that Verra and indeed Gold Standard and others are not-for-profit companies. And so I would hope, therefore, that any kind of monopoly wouldn't be a factor. I'm going to wrap it up there. Obviously, the very first thing I must do when I wrap up is to thank Peter and David for their time. Thank you very much for, firstly, the time you put into this webinar, but also the prep that we've done for it to make sure that it runs smoothly. So thank you very much for that. If you want to know more about their work, their respective websites, and I think Peter's put some details of the course that he runs at the EUI in the chat. So please feel free to reach out to our guests and to me if you want to know more about what Net Zero Markets is doing. We're trying to distill the voluntary carbon market into a single hybrid carbon offset that has a path to net zero designed for corporates. But last but not least, I would like to thank all of you in the audience that are still with us for your participation. Thanks and goodbye.
If we never don't know, someone's gotta change.